the discussion, I will invite everybody to, because we have a big number of people, so it can be difficult to give you the floor individually if you raise your electronic hand. So I would prefer to collect questions and moderate. So I will invite people to ask questions in the Q&A box that you can see on the right of your screen. If you want to be anonymous, you can also send your question to myself or to Madeleine in the chat box, and then I will just present the question without your name being visible. Otherwise, we are welcoming a broad discussion in the Q&A section. So thank you once again for being here, and Gulnaz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone who is joining us for this discussion. I look forward to Q&A session. It's very hard to come up with a, with everything that is going on, summarizing some key points will not be very easy. So I'm going to focus on informational issues, starting with I guess everyone understands that the pandemic is a big stress test for the operation of the power vertical in Russia. And it's also a good time that reveals relationships between the federal center and the regions, including the norms, rules, and incentives that guide behavior of governors vis-a-vis the center. The key measurements that matter at this point in time for the Kremlin are the rates of the infection spreading, and to a certain extent, of course, the extent of mortality. And these are the measurements that the regions care about, that the state officials care about. And you might have noticed on May 11th, Putin announced a gradual reopening and the beginning of the end of the pandemic in the country. Also with the number of additional social measures to help families, low-income families, families with kids, and even small and medium enterprises that didn't get attention and funding earlier. So there are a number of programs that we can discuss later on that were announced on May 11th. Was a very sort of long-awaited measures on one hand, and maybe a compensation to a certain extent to all the criticism that the Kremlin, the government, has been gathering for not providing enough help. Now, you studying other statistics on pandemic in other countries, we all know that it's very hard to predict, for example, when the peak of the infection happens or when the plateau hits. And now we have some miracles happening in Russia, and the Russian miracle style conversations started already late March, early April. You might, if you see sometimes Solovyov, Dr. Мясников, etc., they did spend some time talking about Russian miracles. But with regard to predicting the peak of the infection, we also have a type of a miracle in Russia, because if you look at numbers, and I don't think I will share right now just to save time and trouble with sharing and getting out of that window. But if you look at the two different stop coronavirus statistics, but also statistics that was gathered by rbk.ru based on federal and regional task forces, these statistics sometimes differ to a certain extent. But you will see that in the spread of the infection in Russia, the peak of the infection, the peak of the spread comes to, you know what date? May 11th. I checked two different, these differing measures from Stop Coronavirus and RBK. On Stop Coronavirus, you will see it's May 10th. On the same number comes from May 11th on rbk.ru. So now, how did that happen? Right, that is a big question. I went yesterday one by one, pretty much most of the regions in Russia on Stop Coronavirus information, all officially presented. And on all that official information, you will see that in majority of Russian regions, the spread of the infection dropped in a very significant way in some cases on May 12th, May 13th, May 14th. And then we have a growth of the infection in many regions, starting around May 20th, 21st, 22nd, etc., towards the end of May. So the conversations about information distortion have started already almost a month ago or so in the Russian expert community, but also in the international media. There were a lot of publications in New York Times, in The Guardian, and Bloomberg discussing, okay, are we getting correct statistics from the Russian regions and from the Russian statistical information on COVID? And I've been following this information a little bit as well, because to us who observe what's happening with regional governors becoming responsible for the results of policies and for policymaking on COVID-related issues, this tells us, what, or at least we can use our previous information about how governors react to specific orders imposed on them, and how they react to the situations when actual results might be very hard to achieve. And one at least analytical frame that allows to think more generally about this issue is Principalagent model of relationship between the federal center and the governors. And basically the types of incentives that regional governors were given with expectations coming from the center about their response and about the results that are expected from them. So in the situation when the governors are afraid or to lose their job, to mess up their career, etc., there are very strong incentives for basically distorting information and for making their region to look as good as they can. And various means are used for achieving such responses and the information. So we can talk more about it in terms of the spread of the information. For example, the very recent things that I was looking at was very miraculous numbers in Dagestan. You know that Dagestan was hit very hard by the COVID, and the rates of infection achieved over 4,000, 4,500, 600 or so of infected. So serious that Putin had to organize a special meeting, and a special sort of plea for help came from the regional both people and the elites. And it came to the point when regional elites, the governor of Dagestan, Vasiliev, couldn't anymore hide the real information from about infections and deaths. So he came out with much higher numbers than were reported officially. At the point when he came out with it about 10 days ago or so, the numbers were about 26 deaths. And he said, in fact, there are around 700 people who have died from pneumonia-related issues, etc. So this became very serious. But what is also interesting is that after the meeting with Kremlin, after the meeting Putin organized with officials from Dagestan, situation in Dagestan, first of all, Dagestan got a lot of help from Moscow, including doctors that were flown out to the region on special planes and stuff. But I apologize. What we see now, the official statistics for yesterday or the day before yesterday, now has that Dagestan has officially 91 people ill, and all the rest, over 4,000 people, have recovered. Right. So there are some miracles happening, which raises a lot of questions. There are the information is not realistic at all at the moment, and people are raising these issues, and the government is trying to respond and check, and what's happening, they do accept that there are over 800 people who are in the hospitals. We know that MCS it has opened new hospitals in Dagestan, and yet the official statistics for up to today, I think, is that there are 91 ill people in the region, which doesn't quite capture, of course, the reality. So we have a lot of this informational tampering. Now, to return to May 11th, Putin's declaration and this announcement of getting out of the pandemic crisis very soon, the beginning of the end of the pandemic, what are the main motivations for such for such declaration and for such announcement. I would point out that there are several motivations. Of course, there are economic costs from the pandemic. In GDP, the recent number I saw was that the GDP fall for Russia in April is 12%. So that's very important, and the predicted fall is also very high. So the government is trying to react to sort of to reduce the economic cost associated with that. There was also still a belief in lower mortality rates. After corrections that were done on Moscow mortality rates, we can also discuss it in Q&A, still with those corrections and with the increasing the number of deaths in Moscow from 636 to around 1600, so more than twice, even after that, the death rates in Moscow, not at the peak, but in April, are still considerably lower than in many other places in New York, in London, and the Russian authorities are noting that, and I think that those mortality rates also play a role in sort of this big effort to open up, to return the economy and society to the normal functioning and to a more mobile functioning. And then, of course, the very important reason is the political reasons behind Putin's intervention as as a leader who announces the beginning of the end of this crisis. And the political motivations are linked to the Kremlin's maintained desire to to organize a referendum on the constitutional amendments. And in fact, just 2 days ago, the promised victory parade was planned for June 24th, and the Immortal Regiment was planned for July 26th. And my understanding is, if not maybe at the beginning of next week, those are some of the rumors and predictions that the referendum will be planned for the first week in July, between July 1st and 8th. Those are rumors, but the insiders are talking about the preparations for referendum have started in the regions and things like that. So there were a number of reasons behind this Putin's intervention on May 11th, with his both announcements, help, and basically the desire to return Russia to normal life. I'm finishing at this point. I hope many of the questions we can discuss more substantively on information distortion issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gulnaz. Let's move to Timothy now.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thanks, Marlene Laruelle and Madeline McCann, for bringing us here. I'm just going to get right into it. A lot of what I'm saying is going to build on what Gulnaz has already told us. So observers have been believing that the COVID-19 pandemic would spell trouble for authoritarian countries by exposing weaknesses in these countries. We already know that China has not fulfilled these expectations and predictions. On the other hand, Russia's response has been considerably more fraught. Nearly 400,000 cases right now, evidence of manipulation in case numbers and death numbers, doctor suicides, all these kinds of things have really been brought to light in the last few months. And during this overwhelming or underwhelming response, two familiar camps have emerged. We have the opposition activists and we have the Kremlin, two groups that we are well familiar with for those of us who study Russia. Now, these two camps, they have their different frames and their different messages. Opposition activists have been blaming the Kremlin for an ineffective and late response, while taking advantage of the moment, this kind of tenuous moment, to push through liberal constitutional changes. The Kremlin, on the other hand, has sought to shift blame to regions, something that, of course, Gulnaz has just shared with us. Some have also claimed that the Kremlin has been trying to shift blame toward the West as well, though it has largely seemed to be directed toward regions. So I want to know who is really winning the battle for the hearts and minds of ordinary Russians. Is it the Kremlin or is it the opposition? So I'm going to share some figures that, here we go, and there, and okay, I think we're ready to go. Okay, I'll bring this to full screen mode. So when we look at just polling data, the story seems to suggest that the opposition is winning, that the opposition messages are resonating best. This is a chart of trust in Putin over time using data from Vizium. On the y-axis, the percent of people who trust Putin, and on the x-axis, the time since January of 2020. So we can see that Putin's trust in Putin among at least Russian survey respondents here, has fallen about 3 to 4% since the beginning of January. But looking at polling data only tells us part of the story. We should be looking also at conversations, and a lot of our conversations these days have been taking place online. So what I've done is I have taken a look at Twitter data. I've scraped about 500,000 tweets, Russian language tweets, and these data come from the Indiana University Observatory on social media. And so I'm going to share some results from this to kind of contextualize the degree to which these different messages are resonating. So the first one I'm going to show is just a figure of the tweets over time. So we can see here that in about mid-March is when the tweets about the coronavirus in Russia peaked. This is shortly after the first case in Moscow and shortly before the lockdown in Moscow and Moscow Oblast, the Moscow region. So we can see that the trend has looked along like approximately like this, and has been consistently dropping since then, but certainly peaking in mid-March. This is not that surprising, but this gives you a sense of what the Twitter conversation has been looking like just descriptively. Again, number of tweets on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. So what are these tweets telling us? That's what I'm going to show you now. So I've already kind of told you that there are these two different camps and there are two different messages. The Kremlin has been pushing messages that this is now a regional problem. This is not the Kremlin's problem. While opposition activists have been trying to say the opposite. This is the Kremlin's problem. We can see here 3 different topics mapped out across time. The first is in purple, and that is mentions of foreign related issues. These are mentions of China, Europe, the United States, or Trump, and other related topics as well. So we can see that in terms of foreign issues, the frequency in mentions on Twitter and Russian Twitter has dramatically dropped. This is not surprising. In early January, most conversations about coronavirus and through kind of March were largely concentrated on international actors, China specifically. Alternatively, we have national and regional mentions as well. So the national topic is things like Putin, Kremlin, the Constitution, and Russia. Whereas the regional topic are mentions of governors or specific cities, or the word oblast and the word region. And so we can see here that the conversation has shifted largely from talking about regions to talking about the national topics related to national interest, and then increasingly now related to regional issues. So what this tells us is that it would seem that the Kremlin message that this is a regional problem, not the Kremlin's problem, seems to actually be picked up in Twitter through tweets, and the shifting nature of the conversation appears to demonstrate that the Kremlin's message is resonating stronger than the opposition message. I don't want to generalize too much beyond this, but this is certainly something worthy of note, worth talking about, especially in the context of polling trends. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about sentiment. So what I've done here is what's called a sentiment analysis. It's basically just an automated technique to study opinions, attitudes, and emotions in textual data. So documents and text. The terms in text And these documents are basically assigned values. So a positive value would indicate something that a word or phrase that is optimistic or favorable or positive, favorable, positive, optimistic outlooks, whereas a negative value assigned to a word or a phrase would indicate pessimism or anger or some kind of disaffection, and a value of 0 right here. This is the key kind of line to be looking at. The 0 line, that's neutral. So what we've seen here is that sentiment in these Russian tweets has dropped immediately or very quickly dropped toward the negative range. So we're seeing negative sentiment, disaffection, anger very early on, as early as mid-February right here. Since mid-February, sentiment has picked up, meaning that people are becoming slightly more optimistic. But I will say that it is still negative, as you can see right here. It is still negative. Having said that, the sentiment among Russians appears, at least through the Twitter data, as we can see through Twitter data, appears to be improving. And so why this could happen is something that we could certainly talk about in Q&A, but what we can really at least take away from this information is that people are becoming more optimistic, have become more optimistic since mid-February, and the trend suggests that it will keep going that way. So I'm just going to quickly conclude that the data are suggesting that the Kremlin's message seems to be resonating rather well, but that this does not mean that people are necessarily satisfied with the Kremlin and the Putin regime. There is still potential for a lot of disaffection directed at the regime. It just means what I've shown is just that the messages seem to be picking up on what the regime is putting out there through potentially through the news, online, all their other formats. So I'm going to leave with this information and let Regina talk about what happens going forward.
Thank you so much, Tim. Regina, would you like to follow?
I am here. Mm-hmm. So this, it was interesting to stop a book at 2020 and think, okay, that'll be the quiet period between before the election cycle, and maybe give some time to see what the response would be. And then, of course, the constitutional changes were suggested and COVID immediately follows. So there's nothing quiet about what's happening in Russia now. And this, what I've been thinking now is very much the extension of the book. So I've moved now from trying to scramble to keep up with and learning new facts about what's happening in Russia to think about organization and frameworks for thinking about the facts. So what are the longer term effects of the virus on politics and political relations, especially when we think about state-society relations? And I'm really focused, as the book is, on the new information that's being revealed about the political system, state-society relations, social preferences and values. So some of this information isn't really new, but it's becoming obvious and bringing to the fore things that aren't usually part of the political discussion. Some of it is bringing clarity through the effects of disinformation, right? So challenging the disinformation model. And some of it is actually new or latent information that's crystallized by the state and societal interaction over the virus. And what I like about this approach is that it demonstrates to everyone, us as analysts, but also Russians who are trying to think about the regime, how the system's been working. And also it appears to be making politics relevant for everyday life. Again, this isn't suddenly new or suddenly realized. This has been a trend since 2018, evident in the work I've been doing on urban activism and regional mobilization and elections. So as a result, what I think we're seeing a little bit is the change in the balance between the stabilizing factors of the Putin regime, the factors that shore up the regime and how they're functioning, and the stressors. And that's the lens through which I want to look at this. And I want to say that what's becoming clear is that while COVID is a critical juncture for many regimes. The confluence of COVID and constitutional change raises the stakes in Russia. So I want to use this stressor stabilizer idea related to two issues that Gulnaz and Tim have already addressed. The first is the power verticals. So there's a lot of debate going on now. There's a very nice piece by Joshua Yaffa in the New Yorker about the hollowness of the power vertical. And in some degree, to some degree, that's overstated. We could talk about how much or not how much, in my sense, it's overstated. But it also stresses or focuses on some of these stressors that we often do not consider when we talk about Russia. So we accept the power vertical as a stabilizing force, and now we're seeing that it could also be a stressor. One point of stress is the appointment system, the sort of rigged elections, the ability to fire governors, and the technocratic turn in the regions has broken some of the core elements of regional governance that would allow a flexible response to the system. So we hear a lot about, and this was in Yaffa's piece, in a lot of pieces, about how governors have learned how to think and make policy for themselves. But in fact, there are other factors that are affecting the response. We see very clearly in COVID the effect of centralization on medical supplies and procurement that are linked to the disinformation system that Gulnaz talked about. We see that links between economic and business leaders are broken in some regions as people are parachuted in and out of the regions. And similarly, changing ties to social leaders, even the Orthodox Church in Russia. And this brings back old debates which have been submerged by the idea that the power vertical is endlessly stable. The second is the confluence of disinformation and principal agent problems that Gulnaz was speaking about. Disinformation changes, a disinformation regime changes the principal agent problem fundamentally. So principal agent arises when lower level officials with better information have incentives to reveal that information for their own benefit or exploit it for their own benefit. But here you have a confluence where disinformation aligns the strategies of the governors and the center. Right. So there's not a lot of enforcement that has to happen there. It's just a coordination mechanism or a coordination dilemma. And we see this is largely held in precisely the way that Gulnaz reports. Those very interesting numbers after the 10th and 11th really reflect the new formula for easement or relaxing quarantine campaigns, where the last 4 days over the next 4 days has to be less than one, right? So reporting new cases is constrained by that. And we've seen reporting and testing conform to that formula. We could talk about that a little more. So here, I would say we need more clear research to understand where principal agent is in play. So there is a new principal agent problem and a very potentially dramatic principal agent problem emerging within regions between governors and lower level officials that are showing us some of the limits of administrative resource arguments as tools to secure compliance. So medical professionals, for example, hold inside information and have been releasing this information informally, whether it's the Doctors Alliance crowdsourced map of problems or reporting of deaths. So for example, the medical workers memorial website reports 3 times the deaths that official statistics do among doctors. And MediaZone tells us that this is 16 times worse than other countries. So what we see is that there's a principal agent problem with doctors, and that this goes back to the optimization reforms where doctors were protesting, and now there are new protests and political actions by doctors that led Gleb Pavlovsky to call doctors truth tellers, right? I think we have to think very carefully about whether this lower level principal agent problem, which is often a cause of localized protest, will become more widespread. So there's a question about whether or not this is generalizable, because these doctors are not only very personally threatened, they're not being paid, and so it makes it a different kind of problem for them. I think what's really interesting here and potentially damaging is that the regime is increasingly resorting to coercion against these doctors who are truth-telling, and that in some regions, very few, but some, we're now seeing regional officials and police stepping up to protect their doctors and not the official statistics. So here we see in this little synopsis some stabilizers. Governors are remaining fairly loyal and preparing to deliver elections and plebiscite results. We can talk about that. But there's still some potential for governors to shift blame to the center, right? So there's a new capacity, I think, here that undermines the power vertical as stabilizing. And the stressors are this new challenge to the disinformation model, the revelation of information about the cost of the disinformation model, and the highlighting of this localized emergence of principal agent that I think we should pay more attention to. And we can talk here about also whether or not Sergei Kiryenko's idea to train and professionalize the core will actually work. And here I just want to very briefly point out that when Russians talk about technocrats, they're very rarely talking about the kind of policy wonks or European Commission, deep-seated, issue-based experts. They're really talking about public administration, and that's causing more problems, I think, than it's solving. So let me just briefly turn to what Tim was talking about, to state-society relations. So we often ignore the fact that over the past decade, society has become more assertive in many ways. This is a little bit cyclical, but we see these measures in polls. We can count protests, we see contested elections, and it looks small often when we look at this. But my recent work based on focus groups and interviews around the Moscow housing campaign, around pension reform, my study of urban activism resonates with new findings by Mikhail Dmitriev and Anastasia Nikolskaya, reported in Znak, that identifies through this very interesting technique they have of focus groups and long, open-ended, semi-structured interviews, an important shift in the values of Russian people and increased annoyance and anger at the central government and President Putin in this last round that coincides with early COVID, and more support for regional governors and more stress on personal freedom and liberties over a strong rule and a strong hand. So this is something that resonates with the work that I'm doing. It confirms Levada's finding that gubernatorial credibility is rising. And it also shows us in the COVID sense, which says a little bit about what Tim is seeing, that people are much more focused on economic concerns than the public health crisis. So if Russians are calling for a more plural government, representation of broad social interests, and bigger responsiveness, how does this translate into a stressor? Well, one way is that it's not translating into support for the existing opposition. So the leaders of the existing opposition, including Alexei Navalny, have very little traction here. But what does seem to have traction is their narratives and their ideas that are crystallizing popular sentiment. So you do not have to like the guy to like the message. And a great example is Party of Crooks and Thieves. And I just want to end by talking about, at the center of this conversation is the concept of trust, and whether people trust the government to respond to their concerns, whether people trust the opposition to respond to their concerns, institutions. What we see, what I see, is that people increasingly trust each other and civil society. There's been a rapid change here. There's a rejection of hierarchy, a rejection of centralization, so that there is a stabilizer here. There's still a fear of returning to the 90s. There's still no sense of what figures can emerge as alternative leaders. a sense of whether the governors could be beneficiaries here, or even a model of evolutionary reform. Although there's demand for evolutionary reform. But the stressor is that the government isn't connected to solving the problems of everyday life, that society is demanding responsiveness and increasing grassroots mobilization. And the risk is that in the context of top-down change that looks very similar to 2011, 2012, that protest will grow. That doesn't predict revolution. That predicts a need for the government to respond either by becoming more repressive, as it did in 2012, or becoming more accommodating, right? Okay, so I'll stop there. Thanks, Marlon. Sorry to go over.
No, thank you, Regina. That's just fascinating. Thank you, the three of you, for this really insightful presentation. We'll now open the floor for the discussion. And as you can imagine, we have 120 people in the audience. So I have all my little post-it to try to manage the discussion. I hope I will be able to go over the majority of the question by trying to have them organized. So a first round of question was about the statistics themselves, and so maybe it's question for Gulnaz. Two different questions. What about, do we have any information on how some deaths are attributed to pneumonia or other kind of non-COVID-19 causes, and how we can have these numbers entering our own statistics to try to have a better picture of what is happening? And how, second question, how would you assess the reliability or unreliability of statistics in Russia compared to other post-Soviet countries, so Central Asia, but maybe also Ukraine and the Caucasus? So maybe Gulnaz, if you want, but of course, Tim and Regina are welcome to jump and also answer these questions.
I'll jump in quickly. Not right now, Giselle. Close the door, please. Okay. Excuse me. So on statistics, first of all, it's very hard to hide deaths and mortality. And if anything, in fact, demographic information, death-related information in Russia, by law, legally cannot be hidden if it exists. So it has to be released. And in Russia, it gets released through excess deaths that are not accounted for. And it is using this excess deaths statistics for Moscow and St. Petersburg. The international media started talking about this, why are these unaccounted deaths, right? And just a few days ago, based on this media attention, the Russian government did have to react to this attention. And Golikova, the vice prime minister, she basically asked all the raw information from the regions. And what we already now have is the new information from Moscow, where the Department of Health has recounted, accepting that the counting mechanisms in Russia differ from those that are advised by the World Health Organization. And they differ because the reason for death is decided by coroner pathologoanatomists in Russia. And usually they care, according to their rules of counting, they care about a specific cause for death. So if there is a thrombosis that was caused by COVID, the cause for death is accounted as thrombosis, not COVID. And so now the Department of Health in Moscow has released all that information, and I mentioned the numbers that have increased the mortality by more than twice for April, which wasn't even a peak period. So we expect, in fact, today's statistics for Moscow was the highest death for the whole period. So that's on death. On spread of the infection statistics, right? That is easier to hide or not to count. Of course, that could be determined, and this is an issue not only in Russia, in many other countries, because the spread is measured by testing. And testing could be regulated, and the number of tests could be limited. And although Russia prized itself, the Russian government prized itself on a very high number of testing in the country, still, in some regions, the numbers are regulated. And this is one of the ways how statistics could be managed by regulating the number of tests. So that would be my quick answer.
Thank you so much, Gulnaz. Yeah.
The second question.
Yes.
The second question on Central Asia and Caucasus. Now, first of all, I should point out that in Russia, I think there is a regional variation in terms of information distortion. So I would say Moscow is probably the best in informational, in statistical accounting. And say, I mentioned Dagestan, but regions in the Caucasus probably would have worse. But this is just like in the electoral data, where regions were very uneven in the extent of fraud. So that's number one. So we cannot generalize on all Russia things that are happening in specific regions. There are regions that are more accurate and less accurate. Now, I didn't follow very carefully Central Asia and Caucasus. My understanding is that Turkmenistan is in denial about COVID entirely and doesn't allow any international observers or anyone in. And Tajikistan for a long time has denied, and recently, early May or something, has accepted that there is a spread. So there is probably a much higher degree of informational control and distortion that is happening in Central Asian countries, maybe not in all those two that I mentioned. I just quickly looked up, but I think in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, there are over 9,000. I mean, the information, the statistical reporting is likely better. I don't know about the Caucasus.
Great, thank you so much, Gulnaz. Now we had a series of questions to Tim about the tweets. Several people were asking, how do you know who is behind the tweets? And of course, how do you try to assess if it's Kremlin organized tweets? What about the presence of bots? So how do you manage put all these elements into account on your analysis? And another question was about how would you compare Twitter in expressing a range of opinion compared to other media? I mean, Twitter probably capture mostly young people, not necessarily the older generation. So the feeling and the mood can be changing, maybe also on if you were using other media than Twitter.
Sure. Thank you so much for those questions. Yeah, the issue of bots was certainly something that I was concerned about as I was doing this analysis. So one thing that I did is I'm aware of is that bots tend to do a lot of retweeting. That's how you spread some kind of fake news, tweet out some kind of misinformation, and then a series of bots will start retweeting it until it becomes a very, very popular story. So one thing that I did was I just got rid of all retweets. That was the major thing that I did. Now there are a lot more complicated ways that you can get at this, and that would happen, going forward. But at this point, I think that does take care of a lot of those issues. But I will say that in general, there was a recent study from Robo-Trolling, which is a kind of a policy publication outlet that just came out a couple of days ago, that actually found that the number of Russian bots tweeting and engaging in posts on VKontakte, like the Russian Facebook, has actually been declining over the last few months, which is pretty interesting. And that those conversations, while some of them have been about COVID-19, other areas of those conversations have largely been about foreign other countries like the United States or the Near East, the Balkans, Poland, that kind of stuff. So I'm not too concerned about the bot issue in the data that I have, but there are certainly ways to mitigate that issue even further going forward. The question about Twitter versus other media, of course, there's the usual caveat that it's hard to generalize too far beyond Twitter. In this case, right now, actually, I think this is the best time to actually look at Twitter, because our lives have become so much, so embedded in the virtual, and have become so virtualized lately. So Twitter, of course, tends toward more younger audiences, whereas VKontakte and other platforms would tend toward older audiences. So that distinction is important. And I mean, there's nothing you can really do about those caveats right now, other than to admit that those exist, and this is the best we can do at the moment. But we've kind of course, scraped VKontakte. We can, of course, scrape Telegram channels, which would also be younger users, but in general, the virtual world is certainly dominated by younger people in Russia and around the world. But I'm hoping that the trends here that we're at least seeing, the patterns that we're seeing, they go beyond Twitter, that maybe they start on Twitter, but then you see them move into the media. And so I'm hoping that some of the data that I analyze should be generalizable in some way. At least the trends and patterns should be generalizable. Whether the individual small details are, that's a different story.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I will have a new round of questions for you in a few minutes. Other question may be directed more to Regina about the potential for unrest, both linked to either social economic situation, either public health concern. And you mentioned some of these elements in your conclusion, but there were several questions asking you to kind of come back on these issues of potential unrest, and also things on questions on Putin's popularity. Do you think that if the situation was to deteriorate, and if there was, I don't know, for example, a second wave of the pandemic, do you think that Putin's popularity could be decreasing? So if you could both discuss on the popularity issue and on the unrest issues, I think that would answer several of the questions we had in the chat.
So, yeah, I'd love to do that. Let me start with Putin's popularity, because we've seen this decline in trust. We've seen a decline in popularity prior to this event, and then escalating in response to the event, maybe, right? Here, I think we can also look at personalism as a stabilizing factor in Russia, but it's a very particular kind of personalism in Russia, right? Putin isn't the guy, he's not Joe Biden slapping people on the back. His personalism stems, I think, from what Steve Fish and his co-author Christopher Ansel wrote as non-charismatic personalism, about effectively solving problems, about being in charge. And this is what the power vertical did. It made Putin seem as if he was in charge. And here, this virus is showing the limits of central solutions to solving these on-the-ground problems. And I think that's a central factor that's undermining Putin's popularity. Now, there's no, and I tried to make this point, right? There's no other person but Putin. And so that remains stabilizing, but personalism and Putin's coattails are likely to be even less effective in 2021 than they were in 2011, which is a really important factor. So we have to go to new methods of managing elections. And here the Kremlin is only offering sort of tired solutions now. While we're all focused on COVID, over here, they're forming new parties, right? So we're seeing the usual Kremlin-led formation of 5 new political parties, and one of which I think is something named Open Discourse or Discursive Democracy. It has deliberation, with these ideas. So that's what I'm thinking about Putin, and where the vulnerability of this system is, but also where the strength remains. On public unrest, I think that what we are seeing is and I'm going to go out there and say a real waking up of society, which didn't happen in 2011, 2012, but a very decentralized and localized one in which regional and local actors are pivotal, and which we have seen sort of mushrooming or exploding across Russia. You see really interesting activism happening in Melonets over merging with Archangels. Many of these people have been involved in other protests, right? And now there's a political protest that seems relevant to their lives. So I think that both politics seem relevant, grassroots mobilization is seen as effective, and getting a response from government, and response is what people want. Now, this isn't, we demand Россия без Putina was never, let's assassinate Putin or get rid of him. It was always, let's throw him out of office through elections. So again, these aren't out of system. They are out of system by definition, but they're asking for within system changes. So these are not revolutionary changes. They are demanding evolution of responsiveness. And I think I just want to say that over and over again.
Great, thank you so much. Would Gulnaz and Tim, would you like to add on these questions? Gulnaz, would you like to add something on that? No? Okay, so I have a second round of questions, this time I guess for Gulnaz, but also maybe for Regina, about the really regional aspect of our current discussion. We had one question about, can we dissociate the level of support for Putin and or the government by region or by social groups? Which is, of course, a very important question, and I'm sure Regina also would have things to add that. And another question was, what about the relationship between state and ethnic minorities inside the crisis? Do we see something evolving in this specific aspect of federalism in Russia in relation to the ethnic minorities and the national republics?
So let me jump in first on the ethnic minorities and the relations, potential effects that we might see. Now, I think systematically speaking, there is always an interest in the Kremlin for, well, trying to get rid of, ethnic homelands. And that is a systematic issue that Putin and other people in the administration and in the media have talked about, the ethno-federalism being the time bomb, that famous phrase, right? So there is that as a systemic issue. Now, the extent to which this crisis might strengthen this agenda is questionable, simply because the biggest weight of responding to crisis comes on regional governors, and in some of those ethnic republics, in Tatarstan, in Bashkortostan, not in all, of course, this gives strength to governors, because we also see that while Putin's support level, approval levels have been falling, the levels for governor support have been rising. Again, it's not across the board, so that will depend on specific regions and specific gubernatorial strategies and the type of relationships that they can strike with their people. For example, in Dagestan with Vasilyev, that's a very questionable, of course, thing. Now, on a very specific thing, we do have something going on right now in the relationship between Nenetsk Autonomous Oblast in the north and Arkhangelsk. And there are serious discussions about merging these two subjects of federation into a single one, against very strong opposition that exists in the Nenetsk Autonomous Oblast. And the biggest reasoning, explanation given to this effort is the fact that the oil prices that represent a key budget resource base for the Nenetsk Autonomous Oblast is drying up. And that's what officials are talking about, that economically it makes sense, and it makes sense from the Arctic policy type perspective of having a big conglomerate with joint resources that can then participate in various big programs, international programs or Russia-based programs, and lobby for the Arctic agenda through this combined region. So we see that specific thing which is on the agenda, but already we see protests against that which are emerging in the Nenetsk Autonomous Oblast, and we have to see how it will play out and how people will react. But the governor of Nenetsk Oblast, who was very supported by his people, he was moved to Arkhangelsk. When he was in Nenetsk, he said, no joining, no mergers. Now he's in Arkhangelsk and he's saying, let's go for it. So we see, unfortunately, again, the issues of trust, which, he had some trust, but that's definitely going away. So that would be my maybe general, but also specific answer, that there is a systemic issue, but how it will play out, it's very hard to answer.
Regina, would you like to add on the question of the level of support by social groups, what we can see from surveys or from regional? Yeah.
here, I think on this particular question is where the way we've been working generally as a social science community is failing. So one of the motivations for the work that Gulnaz, Tim, and I have been trying to do is find a way that we can actually get good regional data, right? So most national surveys and Levada's surveys tell us about attitudes towards governors in general, but not specific governors. So we don't know which governors are popular. We have some nice ratings that Russians put out where they do assessments. Certainly the Kremlin's almost weekly surveying gives them that information, but we as analysts don't have that information. So it's. I think that this is a big hole where social scientists need to jump in and try to collect more accurate data, particularly so we can understand this concept of Boolean attribution. So what types of regional policies, regional structural variables, and gubernatorial attributes make it easier or less easier for the Kremlin to shift blame downward within this, information authoritarian context. So it's not an answer, it's a plea. I'm making a plea.
Great, thank you, Regina. There was a second round of questions for Tim also, this time more on the contents analysis of the tweets. There was two questions, one asking you if it's possible on your data to dissociate the fact that the feeling is becoming less negative, is that toward the Kremlin, the federal power, or is that toward the regions? Is there a way to dissociate that? And another question about what you mentioned about governor, the fact that, or about the region, the fact that the Twitter sphere is growing, the discussion are growing about region. How do we know that it's not a negative narrative like the one you were presenting, this kind of opposition narrative growing about regional topics? How do you assess this kind of contents issues in your analysis?
Thank you so much for those questions. So can I tell you whether the more optimistic sentiments, the more positive sentiments have to do with regions or national concerns? I cannot right now. That is certainly possible. And that is something that I had already considered, but it's a very useful question and very useful way to think about this, because it's time, once we know this kind of information, I mean, we don't even, this is, I haven't seen yet any kind of sentiment study done of Russian tweets. So this is at least a step forward, and we get a better understanding of what the trends are, at least on the conversations on Twitter concerning the coronavirus. So at least in aggregate, we know that things are Russians are becoming slightly more optimistic, though again, I will still say that on average, it is still negative. And the move toward more positive sentiment is happening rather slowly. It's been happening for a few months now. Now, disaggregating between whether this is directed at regions or national level, Kremlin, Putin, I can't tell you that right now. But that's certainly, whoever asked that can send me an email and I can get back to you. In terms of the question of, can you repeat that, Ashima?
Yeah, the question was about how do you measure what is positive and what is the opposition narrative?
The opposition narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so whether the opposition's narrative is resonating as this kind of in terms of positive sentiment versus negative sentiment. I hope I'm answering this question the way it was asked. I would assume that, and then we have so I would assume that the opposition directing its conversation toward the national level is probably trying to portray a negative sentiment. So I would say that if the conversation is becoming more positive over time, then this is probably good for the Kremlin. Now, at the regional level, when we start looking at regions, there is certainly a lot of variation. That's exactly what Regina was just pushing us. We need to start thinking more regionally. Even if we just look at the United States, the amount of variation at the state level is so widespread. We see the exact same thing in Russia about how people are responding to the different governors in the midst of the their coronavirus response. Different economic variables are certainly at play here. And so this is certainly, of course, all these things can be done. And I'm looking forward to keep to doing this further. And for those of you who are really interested in the kind of getting at the in hearing what I can come up with at this more micro level or this kind of regional level information, please let me know. Please email me. I'm happy to talk to you further about this.
Great, thanks, Tim. We had a series also of questions that I think could be answered by the three of you. So I will also try to summarize them and let you answer in the order you want. We had a question about what do we know about the government trying to monitor the conversation on social media globally about the crisis, and more specifically, do we have any evidence that the Kremlin is trying to control the regional narratives on the crisis? So the question is, if the government really following what is happening in the region and considering it can be positive or negative to itself, or do they let the regional discussion live their own lives independently? Who would like to begin on this question? Gulnaz?
Yeah, very difficult question, but a very important one. Absolutely. Well, on the level of official information and statistics that is given out, I think there is a degree of coordination with the center, but there is also information asymmetry. So for example, just relying on anecdotal data, there was this audio clip of a conversation of a Lipetsk governor with his deputies about fixing numbers, and it was presented in the media that they were talking about fixing numbers on the spread, and a few days after, the press services for the governor and the governor himself came out saying that the conversation was not about the spread, but about the tests, and that the governor was trying to convince to present the regional and federal authorities. So they're sending up the numbers with the factual numbers, and the number was there 70 or 100 tests per 100,000 population was done in Lipetsk. So the governor was trying to suggest that he stood up for the facts, which he says was 100, which makes us look good. With the 70 that was actually reported, it makes us look bad. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that while there is communication and coordination in terms of the data and the discussion of the data and the presentation and the media coverage of that data, there are also processes within the gubernatorial apparatuses where they control that data and they sometimes could tamper with it. So there is that space for informational asymmetries that could play out. And therefore, in fact, even officially speaking, the data given out on task forces from the region sometimes differ from the data that is given out on federal statistics. So these are there could be two different official data for the federal that comes, as a regional and at the regional task force itself. So there are divergences. They are not necessarily huge divergences. In terms of like big differences in media coverage and narratives, I think, of course, that depends on the extent to which regions are impacted. And the narrative in Dagestan cannot be controlled by the narrative in Moscow, that's for sure. So we are talking about the extent to which the society has been affected by the illnesses, to which people have their family members, their loved ones, their friends and family who are in the hospitals, who observe what's happening, etc., and no information about easing up, about the plateau, about reopening everything. That type of information does not resonate, and they have their own types of narratives that are emerging out of. So it's very hard to fight with that reality, to hide those numbers. And that's what we saw when Vasilyev himself, governor of Dagestan, came out with real numbers, suggesting that, well, 26 is not a correct number. In fact, we have 700. So he did that not to be made fun of, because in fact, everyone is making fun of politicians this day. I didn't yet see, but Galkin, I think, impersonated Sobyanin and Putin on this agenda for or schedule for walks in Moscow, right? So the number of jokes that is emerging, and that is also very revealing of the relation of the society to the state officials, is emerging, and also colors the state society relations. But governors are very much aware that they cannot hide everything, and those that the regions that suffer from very huge impact, they have to come up with more realistic numbers, not to be made fun of, and that's what Vasiliev did.
Thank you, Gulnaz. Regina, would you like to add something?
I would like to add just another place where we see a former stabilizer emerging a little bit as a stressor is that the Kremlin early on was trying to use comparisons with international context, other countries, as a sort of advertisement for their effective response to the virus. And you couldn't get reports of the outcomes in Russia without comparing them to the UK and France and so forth and so on. And all that did was raise questions about disinformation, right? That highlighted these big questions about disinformation, sort of flipping the script on the attitudes about the utility of international comparisons. And now, interestingly enough, when the data is reported, those data are not included anymore. So that's sort of gone away. And so it led me to think in this sort of stressor stabilizer, is COVID, and maybe this is also true in the US, where our own president has tried to deflect blame by using international boogeymen and blaming China and so forth. Maybe this is not a place where that international argument will work. And I think that's a really interesting question for us as a community to think about. We tend to think that this is a universal trend or a universal tool for the regime, but it seems to have some limits, and COVID is pointing out limits.
Great. Tim, would you like to add on that also?
Yes. So I just want to build a little bit on what Gulnaz said. So the Kremlin is certainly in some ways trying to control the message, but its interest is in controlling the message as it relates to at the national level. I mean, it is concerned about how bad press about the regions, about the governors in these different regions affects its own image. But part of what it's been doing is shifting this blame, shifting the problems of in the response, in testing, in case numbers, in the economic issues to the regions. That's where the Kremlin is really trying to push it. I mean, we haven't been seeing much from Putin in the last couple months. He hasn't been all that active, and he hasn't been talking all that much about the coronavirus. He comes out occasionally, but he's pushed a lot of that, the national level narrative to a certain group led by Moscow Mayor Sobyanin. So, so there is this intent to control a message, but the messages, the control over messages is largely about shifting blame, making it so that anything that goes wrong, it's the region's fault. And I can imagine that once things start picking back up, I could imagine that the Kremlin might start trying to take credit for some of the good news, if there hopefully is good news.
Great, thank you, the three of you. We also had question, and you can see I'm moving to kind of reconnecting the crisis to the more general situation in Russia and to the other timely topic that was the constitutional referendum. We had a question on how the discussion on the crisis and the discussion also over potential disinformation management of the crisis is affecting the timing, the contents, and the outcome of the constitutional referendum. So Gulnaz mentioned that briefly in her speech, saying that maybe the referendum would happen in July. But if you could, the two of you or the three of you, Gulnaz, Regina, maybe Tim, also developed on this kind of connection between the management of the crisis and the timing and the outcome of the referendum.
If I can jump in, my understanding is from the very recent public opinion polls that of those who support Putin, which was like 25%, around 75% were planning to participate in the referendum, and the general numbers, I think, was around 48% of people who were planning to participate, and maybe what the percentage was, I don't remember, in terms of who didn't plan to participate. So I didn't check these very recent numbers with the numbers for 1 month before, in April, late April. I think Levada then was surprised to realize that, well, people were planning to go and vote for approve constitutional amendments. So I expect, I have to check, I expect negative dynamics on that, along with lower support for Putin. And what I want to bring up, another thing, is that we still have more than 1 month to go, even if it is planned. There are discussions that it will be outside in the open, right? This is also just from yesterday. The Rospotrebnadzor, Anna Popova, said, we suggest to have the referendum outside. So there will be new, shelters built for people to come, and everything should be organized. And this organization might have already started. But the thing is that if we see that peak mortality for Moscow is in May, for regions is going to happen at least in June. So it might evolve so that as regions are hit by really difficult circumstances with regard to coronavirus, whatever the numbers show, but what the hospitals will show is important, right? Then the referendum might be planned for the time when regions go through the heaviest period. So that's something that that I think is to watch out for. So that, therefore, the earlier predictions and assessments by pollsters about, Kremlin can organize it, I think are made more complex by the situation in the regions with regard to coronavirus in June.
Thank you. Regina, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so I do think it's more complex. I think it's more complex than maybe even the Kremlin realizes right now. But I also have seen lots of, and maybe this is symptomatic, lots of reports of old strategies coming out. So people are being ordered to show up at the polls. People are being ordered to bring their friends. The old tactics that we've seen develop, but also these new laws that allow for mail-in voting and online voting, all of these changes also make it easier for the regime to manufacture votes. So in a sense, and we saw this in Moscow where it was supposed to be blockchain voting in 2019, but in fact the transparent elements of blockchain voting were eliminated from the process. So that may discourage turnout, right? If people can only vote by mail or can be identified in some way with their vote, that could discourage turnout. And it may be that the regime can tolerate low turnout given that we have coronavirus. So we expect low turnout because it's coronavirus. That's a nice story they can tell. I just want to, I myself was making this mistake a lot. So there's actually a provision for referendum in Russian law, codified in Russian law, that has turnout requirements. This is not that. There are no turnout requirements. This is more like a plebiscite, an endorsement. So turnout, playing with turnout is another strategy. So I expect that it will pass, but I also expect that it will be highly manipulated, and I expect it'll be another grievance that people articulate. And so I guess I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Tim, would you like to add something?
Sure. I think one interesting thing about this constitutional changes, about these proposed constitutional changes, and then whatever's going to happen with voting, is that Russian people are quite confused about what these constitutional amendments mean. It's part of the reason we've seen so little opposition, public opposition and outcry as a result of after the proposed changes were announced in January. And frankly, these changes are even confusing a lot of experts. Now we have a kind of a better sense of what they're going to try to do, but I can imagine that a lot of this confusion is actually intentional. and whereas kind of what Regina said is that it's really interesting that they're going to be okay accepting lower turnout if that's the case, because usually the Kremlin is really pushing for higher turnout. They want to show that the people support it. This is that they have the majority of people's support, and that this is that they have the people's backing in whatever that they do, and whether it's elections or these kind of plebiscites. So the fact that they're kind of starting to move the other direction, accepting that maybe we just accept lower turnout, we blame it on the coronavirus, that would be a very, very interesting outcome of all of this.
Great, thank you for these points also. So we have 10 minutes left, and I have the big question, if I may say, that several people ask, and that was also in the title of the presentation, about the vertical of power, and what all the crisis is telling us about how the vertical of power is working, not working, and what can be its kind of strategies of surviving, with this specific aspect that was also the core of our discussion about this kind of uncontrolled or unexpected decentralization that we see emerging. So I would like each of you to give you the floor for like 2-3 minutes maximum, so you can make some concluding remark on this big aspect of the vertical of power and the unexpected decentralization. Gulnaz, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I think the vertical of power is muddling through, so to say, with certain problems and weaknesses being exposed, and certain threats and dangers emerging as we go through this period. And something that I wanted actually to bring out for discussion, we might not have time for it, but this curious case, unprecedented case, when a former governor of Chuvashia, Ignatiev, filed a lawsuit against Vladimir Putin about a week ago in the Supreme Court. That lawsuit was taken for processing, assigned to a specific judge, and around 30th of June, so in about a month, we're going to see what the results will be. This is quite unprecedented, right, from a former governor who was fired late January, according to the official explanation, for the loss of trust by the president. And now, this is a very curious case. I wanted to bring it for discussion because I want to also add a little nuance that Ignatiev himself, from early May, is in the hospital in St. Petersburg right now in a very critical condition, not just artificial lung ventilation, but ECMO in Russia, when your whole body is connected to, your blood is being artificially filled with oxygen. So it's like a very last stage that is used. So I don't know what will happen today, tomorrow, or whatever. So to me, like I am just as an investigator thinking about this. Who did this? Is it his lawyer? Who are the forces behind him? Is it him? Or is it because threatening a potential loss of life, and his family is in trouble because losing a husband who has also lost his position as a governor that allowed him certain privileges, but with the way he lost power, those privileges he doesn't have. So very interesting things are going on, which are quite unprecedented. And it's like, not quite a movie, of course, it's real life, but it's all in progress and development. So it's very hard to bring out any final conclusions as to, is it going to hold? It has been modeling through with very interesting developments occurring. So let me put that as quite a general answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Timothy?
Yeah, so what's interesting again is that we all thought that authoritarian countries are all going to collapse in the midst of this pandemic, that all their weaknesses would be exposed, that the corruption would come forward, and that people would rise up and call for change, or even revolution. And we haven't seen that. We've seen a surprising stability across the board, whether it's in China, which is now cracking down on Hong Kong, whether it's in Iran, and I can envision that something similar would happen in Russia. What's interesting with Russia, again, is that Russia has been particularly bad at responding to the pandemic. And so there are these interesting areas where new individuals, new elites, and perhaps opposition figures could step in. Whether we see that, I'm not optimistic about that. But what is interesting about the decentralization of power to respond to the coronavirus in economic and health terms, what's interesting about this decentralization is that we might see regional elites kind of piggybacking off of what Gulnaz said, regional elites stepping up, and we could potentially see some regional figures becoming more opposed to Putin and becoming kind of an internal focal point for change. Now, whether that means that Putin is no longer in office, that's hard to say, but it could mean that there are going to be changes that are more in line with responding to people's demands, more focused on accountability and response. So I'm not going to sit here and say that I think Putin's going to be out of office, but I do think that there will be some kind of systemic change.
Thank you. Regina, the last word would be for you.
Let me very quickly say that I do think there are some outlines here for evolutionary change. So as we see more localized protests, more regionalized protests, governors will need more flexibility to respond to these demands, to respond to social issues, and that there are issues that have been revealed in this crisis, which we're still beginning to talk about, such as the lack of medically based procurement decisions for medical equipment, for example, that these are going to require greater decentralization. And I'm going to say that maybe some of that decentralization will be apparent in the organization of the government, and a change in how both meta region and regional representatives of the government begin to work with regional officials and the lowest level experts in these countries. So that might be a place where we might start to see change. And for me, this raises really important questions that comes out of Brian Taylor's work on the power ministries and the way that they work with the regions. And are we going to start to, where are the boundaries of decentralization? Do they work for some ministries and not others, some programs and not others? So again, it's a sort of open question, but I think that there is pressure for change, and that's where we're likely to see change. And it will vary by region. Again, it's a sort of our story. Gulnaz and I began in the regions, and we're talking about the regions again.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for these three great presentations. I think we really discussed a lot of things that are so important for the future of Russia, and things are kind of going on live for us and for Russians, and we will be continuing working and looking at that. Would like to thank you, the three of you, for being with us today. I would like to thank all our participants. Also a reminder to our participants that on the PONAS Eurasia website, you can see all the memo that we have been publishing looking at the situation now, and that our speakers have already a memo there looking at this regionalization trend. So please have a look on our website where you can download all the PONAS memo. Once again, thank you, everybody. Next week, we will have another event on June 4th looking at the state of Russian nationalisms. Will be in discussion that I will organize myself with my colleagues Andreas Umland, and we will have other events by the end of June continuing to follow the situation in Eurasia and in Russia in particular. So once again, thank you all to all participants, and thank you to our three great speakers for this really wonderful discussion. And stay safe and at home, even if everything is getting lifted progressively. Bye-bye.